Okay, picture this. It's late 16th century London. The streets are gritty, the air is thick, and the whole entertainment landscape is standing right on the edge of a massive seismic shift. Welcome to our explainer on an absolutely fascinating underdog to legend narrative. Today, we're looking at the very first professional English writers. They were this rebellious squad of literary rock stars who completely revolutionized theater and ultimately paved the way for the golden age of English drama. So let's dive right into our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll figure out exactly who the Wits were. Then we'll meet the key writers in the group. After that, we'll look at how they went about uplifting the English language, explore their massive role in shaping the Renaissance, and finally, wrap up by looking at their legacy as the direct predecessors of Shakespeare. All right, part one. Who were the Wits? To really get these guys, you have to understand the intense socioeconomic anxiety of their era. Now, funny enough, the term University Wits wasn't actually a club they started themselves. The name was coined way later in the 19th century by a literary historian named George Saintsbury. He used it to describe this incredibly brilliant, though pretty loose, collective of graduates from Oxford and Cambridge. You see, imagine being a highly educated guy back then, holding a master's degree, but stepping out into a world where there are just absolutely no job prospects. Sir Francis Bacon even wrote an essay around this time pointing out the problem. The schools were pumping out way more scholars than there were actual opportunities. And these guys, well, they definitely didn't want to take up the humble trades of their fathers. They just couldn't picture themselves, mending shoes for a living. So, driven by this bitter anxiety and a very real, desperate need to survive, they turned to the booming, secular world of the London theater. And by turning to the stage, they bridged this massive cultural gap. It's like night and day. Before the Wits, English theater was really divided. On one hand, you had these simple, anonymous medieval morality plays, or maybe some basic interludes performed privately just for the nobility. But then the university would show up and they bring their elite classical academic training straight to the gritty, popular street theater. In doing so, they created something entirely new, Renaissance drama. Suddenly, plays were complex. They featured realistic, messy human emotions, and they were written by actual professional authors for a huge, diverse audience. They literally transformed the entire entertainment landscape. Moving right along to Section 2, Meet the Key Writers. Let's take a look at the starting lineup for these startup founders of Elizabethan theater. We've got to kick things off with Christopher Marlowe. He was arguably the most infamous and brilliant of the bunch. He was a Cambridge boy, actually the son of a Canterbury shoemaker, but his life in London was a total 180 from his prestigious education. He had this incredibly wild vibe, navigating a dark underworld that involved mysterious undercover activities and even royal espionage. What's really fascinating here is the sheer clash between his art and his personal life. On stage, he's writing absolute masterpieces like Tamburlaine and Dr. Faustus. He's exploring these deep, humanistic themes with extreme, overreaching protagonists. But offstage, his life was just chaotic and violent. He was accused of atheism and counterfeiting, operated as an actual spy for Queen Elizabeth's Privy Council, and, get this, he was famously stabbed to death in a house in Deptford in 1593 over a reckoning, basically a deadly dispute over a bar tab. Pivoting to a wildly different personality, we have John Lilly. He was the refined Oxford graduate of the group. And honestly, before he even wrote a single play, he was already the absolute literary sensation of his age. Just looking at his achievements, his massive popularity makes total sense. He wrote a runaway bestseller called Euphues' The Anatomy of Wit. He wasn't a street brawler like Marlowe at all. In fact, he even served as a member of Parliament. But his true, lasting legacy is how his flexible, highly patterned dramatic prose laid the foundation for all the romantic stage comedies that would completely dominate the era. He's widely considered by many as the literal father of English comedy. Next up on the roster is Robert Greene. Now, Greene is fascinating because he is arguably the first truly professional author in England. He somehow had to balance his life of academic letters with these deep bohemian sympathies for London's absolute lowest classes. His life was, for lack of a better word, pure chaos. The guy held degrees from both Cambridge and Oxford, yet he totally immersed himself in the criminal underworld. He even kept the sister of a notorious thief named Cutting Ball as his mistress. But Greene's popular romances, his pamphlets, and plays like Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay completely captivated the literate London public. And his death? Just as dramatic as his life. He reportedly died from a lethal, literal binge of pickled herring and Rhenish wine.
The final key writer we're highlighting today is Thomas Nash. Nash was basically an anti-Puritan provocateur. His pen was so incredibly sharp and his wit was so excoriating that he actually managed to terrify the highest levels of the English government. Nash's career was disruptive on a whole different level. He wrote The Unfortunate Traveler, which is widely considered the very first English picaresque novel. But his controversial satires? They went way, way too far for the authorities. His work was so biting that it was specifically called out in the 1599 bishop's ban, an order that literally forbid satire and resulted in his books being burned. He even had to flee London for Great Yarmouth after co-writing a play called The Isle of Dogs, because the government deemed it highly seditious. Let's move to Section 3, Uplifting the English Language. So beyond all their wild, chaotic biographies, how did these guys actually fundamentally upgrade the mechanics of the English language itself? This concept of Euphuesian brilliantly illustrates John Lyly's impact. He created a style so distinctive and elegant that absolutely everyone wanted to imitate it. But here's where it gets cool. When you combine Lyly's structured elegance with Thomas Nash's highly energetic, colloquial, and often brutal street satire, suddenly you have an English prose that is deeper, more flexible, and vastly more expressive than anyone had previously imagined. Together, they prove that English could be the language of both high art and incredibly sharp popular debate. And meanwhile, over in the world of poetry and tragedy, Christopher Marlowe was performing a total miracle of his own. With his play Tamburlaine, he introduced unrhymed blank verse to the commercial stage. It became legendary as Marlowe's mighty line. It set the absolute gold standard for dramatic literature because it allowed actors to speak with a rhythm that felt natural but was elevated enough to completely hypnotize the audience. Section 4. Shaping the Renaissance. Let's zoom out to the macro level and synthesize how this tiny group of desperately employed grads forged a new golden era. I want you to really think about this for a second. How does a highly controversial group of brawlers, spies, and satirists actually trigger a literary golden age? Well, the secret lies in their unique formula. They successfully blended strict classical humanist education with highly entertaining, popular street theater. Just tracking their progress over these few years shows the startup velocity of their impact. The innovation is staggering. In 1578, Lyly pioneers comedic prose. Flash forward to 1587, Marlowe makes blank verse the standard for tragedy. By 1592, Greene is mastering the synthesis of high academia and the gritty street. And then, in 1594, Nash invents the English picaresque novel. They were iterating and building this massive theatrical renaissance at absolute breakneck speed. And that brings us to Section 5, the final part of our explainer, the predecessors of Shakespeare. All of this rapid innovation essentially laid the groundwork for the most famous writer in history. So, the crucial point we have to make here is this. William Shakespeare did not invent Elizabethan drama out of thin air. He inherited it from the University Wits. He borrowed Lyly's elegant comedic structures for plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream. He adopted Marlowe's mighty line and those heavy tragic themes for masterpieces like Macbeth. He channeled Nash's energetic street-level satire perfectly into the beloved character of Falstaff. And of course, he sparked intense rivalry. Robert Greene famously attacked the young Shakespeare in print, calling him an upstart crow who was basically beautifying himself with the wit's feathers. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating question to ponder. If these brilliant, chaotic university graduates hadn't been so desperate for work, if they hadn't been forced down into the gritty London theater scene just to survive, would we even have the Shakespeare we know and love today? Their underdog legacy is literally the bedrock of English literature. Thanks so much for exploring this amazing piece of history with me, and I really hope this leaves you hungry to dig even deeper into the roots of the stories we still love today. Catch you next time.